Yo, 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 welcome back to the Anomalies of History, Part 5. And we're starting to get into some seriously juicy topics now, some of my favorite. Now, the title of this one is called The Land of Khem. And this is one of the greatest stories that I've discovered in my life. Now, I told you already that in 2003, I went to Egypt, I met Hakim, and then I had to come home and deal with the passing of my mother, which has always resonated with me, mostly in a positive way. But I also didn't mention that in 2000, I lost my father. So I was a 25-year-old kid, whole future ahead of me, but I didn't have my parents to ask questions. So that forced me really to start studying, self-studying. I'd already been to university studying film, but I wanted to know more about this esoteric wisdom and all this stuff we're not told at school. So for the next few years after I lost my parents, I was just working. I was practicing to be a DJ and just reading so many books. And I couldn't help thinking about this guy, Hakim. I almost felt like he wasn't real until 2005. I was randomly watching Discovery Channel and I saw him on this wonderful 5-part documentary called The Pyramid Code. Now, in the last episode, I mentioned that I'd met Robert Bauval in Cairo. And Robert had yet to meet Hakim. But as I was watching this TV show, not only did I see Hakim in one episode, but Robert was in a similar episode. And I've managed to keep in touch with Robert Bauval all this time. And apparently they never actually met during that time. They just filmed on different locations. But everything that Hakim was saying in this documentary suddenly started resonating with me, and all the teachings that he gave me in the 4 hours that I was at his house, they all started to decode, and it was just mind-blowing experience. So what I want to do to start off this little chapter is just show you a clip from the Pyramid Code, which just changed my life forever.
Here we are at Saqqara. This is the famous step pyramid of Djoser. Djoser is a title to the king of the third dynasty, 2900 BC, roughly, said the books.
The step pyramid is located in a big courtyard, much older than the pyramid itself. And you can compare yourself with the same eye. You look at the pyramid and you look at the wall, you can see the difference.
These chunks of stone in front of Hakim are quartz crystal characteristic of the area.
If we go back to the ceiling here, then it reflects the crystal tile on the ground. This is what's left of it. This has been quarried by the natives in the area in the 17th century.
We see the remains of a quartz floor at Giza in the temple to the east of the second pyramid.
Now I'm pointing the Jed pillar, which is symbolizing one of the ancient gods, Osiris. And Jed is the word we still use to address the older people, like grandmother and grandfather, Jed. It goes back to the story of Osiris and his brother Seth, the bad guy, who put Osiris in a coffin, throw him in the ocean. The ocean took him place Phoenicia, Lebanon today, and there is the cedar tree grows, and the roots of the cedar tree captured this coffin. Till it has been found by his beloved sister Isis. She cried, her tears touched his body, and they lived together again for a short while, short enough to make a baby with the name of Horus.
The story of Isis, Osiris, and Horus is fundamental to Egyptian cosmology. Isis is connected to the star Sirius, and Osiris is connected to the constellation of Orion. Horus is their prodigal son.
I take you now to see that hospital, the healing with the sound.
Stories about ancient healing techniques were passed down from generation to generation by the elders. Hakim explains how sound played a part in diagnosing and healing patients.
That line of construction, you see, like 3 chambers, it's what's left of the house of the spirit. And it's a healing system with a sound. It's a medical investigation table. The patient have the right to use either side of the stairs. One on the right, one on the left. So he have to follow, or she have to follow her own antenna to climb up there and choose the point where she stands. Because each point is connected to a chick chamber. We have 22 of them, 11 on each side, no ceiling. And when you go inside, you can see a niche where the physician put his head in the niche to see what's the matter with his patient laying on this table. And that works with the sound. And the sound source is running water in a tunnel underneath here. So it's a big map of tunnels underneath here.
Let's consider that the pyramid sites along the Band of Peace are sophisticated harmonic structures, not only mirroring positions of the stars, but designed to replicate harmonic cavities of the human body. It seems that the chambers in the pyramids are harmonically tuned to a specific frequency or musical tone. Sound healing techniques were used to restore the patient's body to the correct harmonic within. This is the view of Abu Sir to the north of Saqqara, and here is the view of Dashur to the south.
Here we are on location at the Bent Pyramid. What you'll notice here is that the construction has two angles.
Traditional Egyptologists will tell you that the Egyptians were practicing building pyramids, and they started building at one angle, then changed their minds partway through. This is the kind of thinking that paints the ancient Egyptians as infantile and misguided. But is there another way of looking at it?
We call these constructions at that area in Dashur related to king called Senefru.
At Dashur, there are 3 pyramids with 3 burial chambers in each, 9 in total. Traditional Egyptology tells us that the entire site was built by Sneferu. If the established story that the pyramids are tombs is correct, why would Sneferu have needed so many?
Sneferu would have had 9 different possibilities and options for where he would have been buried, which again is illogical. So this comes back to the fact that understanding the Egyptians in terms of traditional Egyptology means that they were misguided and illogical. I don't think this was the case.
Come to the word Senefru. Sin means double. Nefer is harmony, so it's double harmony. It's not a name of a person, but it's the energy we get from these constructions.
Let's consider that the pyramid sites along the Band of Peace are sophisticated harmonic structures. It seems that the chambers in the pyramids were harmonically tuned to different frequencies or musical tones.
The Bent Pyramid, it has 2 chambers for 2 different sounds.
Each chamber in each pyramid, then, could be exemplifying sound technology with distinct tones, creating huge fields of harmonic resonance.
And welcome back. And after that, I just basically started reading every book about Egypt on, on the pros and the cons sides. I was reading books that would argue theories that I was mostly invested in to try and keep a balance. And I've always done that. But most importantly, what I've been doing over time, as new theories come out, I've allowed my mind to evolve. I've never gone back. And if I was wrong about something, that's just part of the learning experience. I don't think you can ever be wrong when you're trying to solve a problem. It's all about finding what's logical. So I want to point out this amazing documentary here, which sadly seems to have been removed now from YouTube. It had millions of comments. I think this, for me, was a groundbreaking documentary where so many of the mainstream skeptics, when they watched this, they started asking questions themselves like, wow, there's something more to this site. There's something more to this culture, something more that everybody should know. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's, as Graham Hancock says, we are a society with amnesia. And I feel like when people say, oh, the woke, it's just a piss take. It's not about that. Waking up to the fact that we've been lied to is a pretty damn big deal in my life. I'm going to show you now the trailer for Revelations of the Pyramids. You can still find it online, but not on YouTube anymore. Here you go.
4,700 years ago, when the rest of the planet was still wandering about in animal skins, the ancient Egyptians flattened a limestone hillock, paved an area the size of 6 football pitches, piled up 2 million blocks of stone to the height of a 42-story building, drove a narrow 300-foot-long passage utterly straight through the rock, fitted the stone in the inner chamber with complete precision, built the outside of the pyramid with 8 sides instead of 4 and made it earthquake-proof. Lined it up precisely with magnetic north and got the whole job done in 20 years using only these.
And welcome back. So after that, in 2007, I basically sold my parents' home. I sold everything that I had. I quit my job. And I went out on this huge project to couch surf the world. How did this come about? While I was living in England, I worked for a record distribution company, and there was a guy called Martin Parry who always saved money all year to then go and travel. And he went and traveled for a year. And when he came back, he came back to work. He said to me, look, when I was traveling, I met this guy who was couch surfing, and you know, he knew that I was living in a family house. I had 2 spare rooms, and he said, maybe it's a good idea if you join. So when I joined Couchsurfing, there was only 18,000 people, and it grew substantially into 180,000 in just the first year that I was on there. So it was relatively new. So I made a profile. For those that don't know what is Couchsurfing, it's basically you invite people to come and stay with you for free. So I had a few guests staying with me in Manchester. And then I just had this idea like, look, what's the best thing I could do for my parents? And I wanted them to go with me and see the world through my eyes. That was my gift to them. So I risked everything. Everybody said I was completely insane. Why would you sell your house? Because I felt like I was a fish trapped inside a bowl. And I wrote a poem about that called The Fish That Can Fly. And it's all about escaping from the bowl. And that's exactly what I did. I sold everything. I set up a website. I had a blog. At the peak of my blog, I had about 16,000 people reading it. And it just escalated into this giant big project. So I spent 3 months in America. I spent 3 months in Mexico, 3 months in Central America, a year and a half in South America, 6 weeks through the Caribbean. And then I was in Canada for 3 months before I flew to Vietnam on exactly 1,000 days of leaving England. All these little synchronized coincidences. And I just basically, I'd had enough. And I decided to stay in Vietnam. And I've been in Vietnam for 15 years ever since. But I've never given up my pursuit of this truth. So if you would like to know more about that trip, go to my Spotify, go to my YouTube, and check out this episode where I've done a summarization of what I call my Slam Jam podcast episodes with some visuals. All right. So that brought me to Vietnam. And while I was in Vietnam, I was talking to a friend, must have been 2010. I was mentioning my story about Hakim, who was just randomly sat in my house. And I'm old school, right? So I forget that you can just go on the internet and Google stuff. But I'd been trying to track Hakim down for quite a while. And back then, there was no like real internet, and mobile phones were not as, as developed. So I just gave up hope. And then my friend just randomly searched Hakim, and we found this website, the Commission School of Ancient Mysticism. And there is Hakim. And I was sad to find out that he'd passed away, or as we say in Egypt, he'd wested. So I just want to give peace to this brother, Hakim. Thank you for everything. Changed my life. And what this did for me is that the more I started thinking about Hakim, the more I started researching about Egypt. As I said before, all these teachings that he gave me all started to make sense. He basically sat down with me for 4 hours and just pounded me full of this esoteric wisdom, and I couldn't process it. But I've been able to do that over time. It's almost like he left a piece of his soul in me. So I was checking out this Khemitology website. I just want to read a little bit about Hakim. So Abd'el Hakim Awyan originated the discipline of Khemitology to address the study of ancient Khemit, the name the indigenous and the ancients used to describe Egypt, or the Black Land. It was named for the rich, dark, alluvial soil that the Nile nourished its banks with during its annual flooding each summer. This flooding of the Nile was a much celebrated event, as it was responsible for the abundance of food supplied from a rich agriculture and symbolized fertility of all things. Fertility's there again. Hakim was particularly fascinated by the evidence left behind by the sophisticated civilization that lived in Khemit from 10,000 to 65,000 years or more ago, whose self-awareness and deep resonance with nature enabled them to develop devices and advanced technologies that mystify us today. Much of our continuing research is focused on the implications of the evidence that these people, who we call Khemitans, left behind for us to discover. The people of ancient Khemit, referred to later as the Sesh, became the original 42 tribes of Africa who, recognizing their connectedness to all that is, considered themselves equal in every way. People we now refer to as Hebrews, Tibetans, Russians, Europeans, and the many tribes of our Black African nations were all, according to the indigenous tradition, original tribes of ancient Khemit. These were a highly advanced people who, utilizing 360 natural senses, were capable of great feats of manifestation, alchemy, and trans-dimensional journeying. They had no need of a written or oral language or the confines of labels, and lived peacefully and naturally with the rhythms, energies, and frequencies of their environment and the cosmos. The ancients all over the world built many powerful enigmatic structures utilizing the elements from their environment, combining them with the energy naturally emanating from the Earth's ley lines, and constructed them in a fabric of sacred geometry reflecting the very cosmology and energetic makeup of our holographic universe. Wow. Okay, so that's just a little bit about his school. While I was researching the school, I came across this wonderful gentleman, the name Stephen Mehler, and it seemed that Hakim had given Mehler all of his teachings before he passed away. This guy is the prodigy of Hakim, and he's an absolute wisdom of knowledge, and I'm hoping I will get him on my podcast soon. We've been chatting, we're actually friends now. So it was his book that I managed to get hold of, which is called The Land of Osiris, which is based off many of the teachings of Hakim. So again, this was perfect for me because there's all this stuff in my head that I couldn't figure out and put the pieces together. And this book was just like, you know, a gift from God's, basically. So I'd just like to finish this little chapter with some readings from one of these books, which mentions Atlantis, which I think is really important as we go through this evolution of real history. So sit back and let me read a few pages. So, with all due respect to my favorite poet, Bob Dylan, I will indeed try in this last section to bring it all back home. To bring it all back home entails venturing into subjects not considered by academics as worthy of a scientific or serious treatment until the last decade or so. Bringing into this discussion the ideas of the myth of Atlantis or possible extraterrestrial contacts, not only in modern times but also with ancient peoples, will have definite reactions. These taboo areas will provide the defenders of academic paradigms just cause to reject. All the concepts and thoughts presented in this book, it is not those people with ossified minds and beliefs that I have been addressing myself to from the beginning of this work, but those who can see and feel the glimpses of the coming dawn, where all ideas and subjects will be open for honest and serious discussion. The topic of the myth of Atlantis has been the focus of varied books and inquiries ever since Plato brought the concept to the Western world in two of his dialogues. The topic of the myth of Atlantis has been the focus of varied books and inquiries ever since Plato brought the concept to the Western world in two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written in the 4th century BC. Plato claimed the story was passed down to the Greek statesman Solon by Egyptian priests. Several other Greek and Roman authors also related similar stories of a great ancient civilization that perished in a series of cataclysmic earth changes. The story of the Great Flood has been found in the mythology and literature of almost all peoples worldwide, which has convinced many authors that it was a real event. In their book, Catalysm, British science historian D.S. Allen, along with geologist and anthropologist J.B. Dallaire, present an effective case for the possibility of a worldwide catalysm occurring very near in time to Plato's dates, for the fall of Atlantis around 11,500 years ago. From my extensive research and interest in metaphysics, I became aware that Plato's Atlantis story and stories of even older civilizations, such as Lemuria in the Pacific Ocean, are accepted parts of Western metaphysical tradition. Groups such as the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Philosophical Society, the Association of Research and Enlightenment, the Order of the Golden Dawn, and the Poor Knights of the Temple of Solomon, aka the Knights Templar, have all accepted the myth of Atlantis as a real event that occurred in time and space. I just want to point out that most of those groups control the world. So if Atlantis is fake, why do they believe in it? And more importantly, why do they worship it? In the early 90s, when I first discovered the works of Edgar Cayce and his channelings about Atlantis, I became very interested in the subject and read many books, especially those of Ignatius Donnelly, Robert Stacey Judd, and Manly P. Hall. Cayce's channelings were fascinating and detailed, and based on the accounts of his life story, he seemed to be a very credible source. The linkage of Atlantis to ancient Egypt was also particularly strong in Cayce's channelings, and for a while it seemed logical for me in my research in its early stages in the night that Egypt had arisen as a result of a migration of advanced beings from the doomed Atlantic island continent. It is also somewhat interesting that Mark Lehner, so often mentioned in this book as one of the strongest proponents of the accepted paradigms of academic Egyptology and highly doubtful of the existence of any previous Khemitian civilization before the dynastic periods, started his career as a follower of the channelings of Edgar Cayce and wrote a book in 1974 in which he supported the story of Atlantis and an ancient Khemitian prehistory. Now, just for those that don't know who Mark Lehner is, he became one of the mainstream narratives and pushed this, this conventional theory. And it's stating there that he was a believer in the Atlantis theory. So why did he change his mind so dramatically? In 1979, when I first heard the tape of the lecture given by Dr. J.O. Kinnaman, it was his declaration that he and Sir Flinders Petrie. In 1979, when I first heard the tape of the lecture given by Dr. J.O. Kinnaman, it was his declaration that he and Sir Flinders Petrie had found proof of Atlantis with ancient records and anti-gravitational machines inside the Great Pyramid. So that fueled my interest in his life and work. It was Kinnaman's declarations that were the final key for me, that obviously Atlantis had been a reality. It seemed early in the 20th century, before Cayce had even channeled any information linking Egypt and Atlantis, that Kinnaman and Petrie had found the physical proof. Of course, it could be argued quite the opposite, since Kinnaman did not discuss this information in public or private before the night, and Petrie apparently never publicly discussed any such alleged finds, that Kinnaman only made the story up after the publication of Cayce's readings in book form. So this argument has been presented to me often by skeptics of Kinnaman's claims, and quite frankly, it cannot be refuted at this time. Since I have stated that Kinnaman claimed he and Petrie entered into an agreement with the governments of Egypt and Great Britain never to divulge the finds in their lifetimes, it remains speculation. However, there was another claim of Kinnaman's that has recently, due to the work of Christopher Dunn, appeared to have some justification. Kinnaman stated that one of the uses of the Great Pyramid was to serve as a giant radio station to send messages all over the earth. Kinnaman claimed there was a passageway off of the secret entrance they found on the southeast corner of the Great Pyramid that led to a spiral staircase that took them down over 1,000 feet into the limestone bedrock. There, in a large room lying on a stone tablet, was a giant quartz crystal ground, convex, that was 30 feet in every direction, long, high, and thick. This giant crystal, with thousands of prisms inserted in it, was the source of the radio transmission. One of the researchers who has been very supportive of the possibility of previous high civilizations existing over 1,000 years ago has been David Hatchett Childress, a prolific writer and world traveler. Childress has authored several books about lost cities around the world, but in his book, Lost Cities of North and Central America, Childress mentions finding an article in a 1960s edition of Arizona Highways magazine, which revealed that Egyptian artifacts had supposedly been found in the Grand Canyon in 1909, and the story had been written up in the Phoenix Gazette newspaper. Childress set out to investigate and found copies of the newspaper articles in a public library. Sure enough, the story was front-page news in the Phoenix Gazette for 2 days running in April of 1909. These front-page articles discussed the discovery of a cave in the Grand Canyon in Arizona containing Egyptian mummies and artifacts. The find was supervised by Professor S.A. Jordan of the Smithsonian Institute, but when Childress called the Smithsonian to attempt to verify the discovery, the head archaeologist and other officials of the Smithsonian denied knowing about such excavation or artifacts. In fact, the Smithsonian archaeologist stated categorically that no Egyptian artifacts had ever been found in North America, and there had never been S.A. Jordan, who was associated with the Smithsonian. In the Denver Museum, I was able to locate back copies of the Smithsonian's annual reports. I did not find the year 1909, but in the 1911 report, the name S.A. Jordan was listed as a field archaeologist for the Smithsonian Institute. There's proof the Smithsonian lied. Think about that. How convenient would that be? Now, in a discussion I had with Dr. A.J. McDonald, President and Executive Director of the Kinnaman Foundation in 1994 about Childress revelations of an Egyptian find in the Grand Canyon, Dr. McDonald related to me that one of the places Kinnaman had stated radio messages from the Great Pyramid was sent to the Grand Canyon in America. Now, again, it is possible as an informed archaeologist, Kinnaman may have known about the Grand Canyon find in 1909 and even known Professor S.A. Jordan and just connected the discovery to the Great Pyramid. But it remains an interesting story nonetheless. Now, we also have Christopher Dunn stating that by virtue of the Great Pyramid acting as a coupled oscillator, tremendous amounts of microwave and radio wave energy were produced. So indeed, the Great Pyramid would have functioned as a giant radio station, just as Kinnaman said it did. Hakim has stated on many occasions that the indigenous tradition has taught that one of the many functions of the Great Pyramid was as a giant communication device, again linking all three sources together in a new paradigm of the Great Pyramid. Now, I can also weave other disparate pieces of information together into a coherent tapestry. In 1992, I engaged in a series of protracted discussions with Hakim on the subject of Atlantis. At that time, he presented a very dim personal view of the myth of Atlantis, a pose which, quite frankly, greatly surprised me. He stated there was no real proof of the myth, and Plato may have fabricated the story of Solon receiving the information from Egyptian priests. When I brought up Edgar Cayce and the Western Mystery School traditions of Atlantis, Hakim stated that they were all just following Plato's lead. The motivation Hakim expressed for taking this stance was the way the Atlantis myth was used to indicate that non-African people created the monuments, i.e. the pyramids and the Sphinx. Hakim objected to the possibly racist way the myth of Atlantis has been utilized, namely an enlightened group of white people escaping a dying continent and civilization came to Africa and taught ignorant, backward indigenous peoples the trappings of civilization. I should mention that it was clear that Hakim was expressing his opinion of the way that the myth had been utilized to promote a racist sense that Africans were not capable of creating high civilization without a Caucasian boost. I have mentioned that Hakim is a vigorous Afrocentrist, and his opinion of the Atlantis myth reflected that stance. Hakim adamantly adhered to this belief in the indigenous Khemitian tradition that Khemit was an advanced civilization and the cradle of humanity and did not need Atlanteans nor anyone else to teach them how to build pyramids and other stone structures. As one who had been deeply immersed in the Rosicrucian and Western Mystery School tradition for many years, I was disturbed by Hakim's stance. I pondered over our conversations for many years without broaching the subject again with him. However, after Hakim's public emergence as an indigenous Khemitian wisdom keeper and master, I brought the subject up again in 1997. At that point, I posited a variation on the theme, as we had already engaged in lengthy discussions of ancient Khemit and the Boo-Wizard sites. I proposed to him that the myth of Atlantis was a mythologue, that is, a general story passed down that referred to the global maritime culture that existed before the flood, before the catalysm of 11,500 years ago, a civilization that was centered in northern Africa in ancient Khemit. I further proposed that if there indeed was a continent of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Africa, it was connected to Khemit, both by trade and tribal bloodlines, and not in any way a separate, more advanced civilization. Now, Hakim was pleased with this postulation and had no problem with an Atlantis theory if ancient Khemit was a major part of the equation. This theory sits very well with me too, as I now believe the Atlantis story relayed by Plato, who was an initiate of Khemitian mystery schools and the indigenous tradition, was indeed referring to Khemit by utilizing the theme of Egyptian priests relating to the story to Solon, and there were other reasons for his version. One of those reasons may have been that Plato, as an initiate of the Khemitian tradition himself, was bound by oath not to divulge the whole story and to protect those still keeping the tradition alive in the dynastic Khemit of this day. And that's exactly what secret societies do now. They keep these traditions to themselves. I now also believe Dr. J.O. Kinnaman may have been using the general Atlantis myth in the same way. Perhaps having found evidence of the ancient Khemitian civilization, he then equated the evidence with the known myth of Atlantis, also connected it all with the Masonic tradition he was part of. In other writings, Kinnaman had indicated he knew that ancient Khemit was much older than Orthodox Egyptologists believed. In presenting this story to a group of Masons, Kinnaman may have used the myth of Atlantis as a catchphrase, as Plato had done, because he knew the time was not ripe for the indigenous Khemitian tradition to be revealed, even to Masons. Now, Christopher Dunn has brought more information into this tapestry of Atlantis. Dunn discusses in his book the reliefs that are found in the underground crypts at the Temple of Hathor in Dendera of Upper South Egypt. Reliefs that indicate the Khemitians were perhaps aware of the principles of electricity. In the Temple of Hathor, Dendera, where these reliefs appear, is a relatively late dynastic temple dating from the Ptolemaic period, ca 100 BC. In one particular panel of the reliefs in the lower crypts, a baboon is shown holding two knives up in front of the apparent giant light bulbs, which we call crux tube, perhaps deflecting the flow of electrons. Many authors have attempted to interpret these reliefs, such as Joseph Jotmans and Moriah Timms, but none has had complete access to the indigenous tradition. Hakim states that what is shown on these reliefs was not knowledge of electricity known to the dynastic Khemitian priests who had them carved, but a previous understanding of energy known to the ancient Khemitians long before the dynastic periods. He further stated that the baboon, a companion symbol of the Dejuiti, the nectar of wisdom, was holding the knives as a warning. What was being shown was a knowledge of energy known to and utilized by the ancient Khemitians that could be and had been abused and misused. Hakim's explanation of the Dendera reliefs leads us to return to Christopher Dunn's observations inside the Great Pyramid. It was also led to a coalescence of what Dunn stated in his book and what I have proposed in the previous chapter. As mentioned, Dunn had stated he has seen evidence that chemicals were used to produce the hydrogen generated by the Giza power plant. Dunn bases his theory on several observations, the first being salt incrustations deposited around the southern shaft on the south wall of the so-called Queen's Chamber, which he believes was the place where the chemicals were mixed and the reaction occurred, thereby leaving the salt as residue of the reaction. He also states that the presence of the two shafts entering into the chamber were not for the conveyance of a dead king's soul, as believed by Egyptologists and other alternative theorists, but for the conveyance of the two chemical solutions proposed by Dunn as possibly being an anhydrous zinc solution and dilute hydrochloric acid. The resulting reaction would produce hydrogen gas and zinc chloride, precipitating out as a salt, thus explaining the salt incrustation on the walls of the Queen's Chamber. Dunn also mentions the dark stained walls of the northern shaft of the chamber, possibly where the acid was deployed and reacted with the limestone walls, indicating two different chemical solutions were used and why two shafts were created. Dunn then proposes an accident occurred, an explosion in the King's Chamber that virtually ended the utilization of the Great Pyramid as a power plant. In his theory, the chemical reaction took place in the Queen's Chamber and the hydrogen gas was then delivered to the King's Chamber, which resonated in acoustical harmonic resonance with the hydrogen, greatly amplifying and intensifying it. But one day, the reaction got out of control and a great explosion occurred, ending the process. Evidence for the explosion mentioned by Dunn is the bulging out of the granite walls of the chamber and cracks in the granite beams in the ceiling. Egyptologists have explained the cracks in the granite as a result of an ancient earthquake, but as Dunn points out, the evidence for earthquake damage is not consistent. There is no evidence of earthquake damage in the descending passage leading to the subterranean chambers, which goes into the limestone bedrock and which would be much closer to the epicenter of an earthquake and should show much more damage than that of the King's Chamber, much higher up in the internal structure of the pyramid. I just want to point out, I've personally been inside the King's Chamber and I've seen is the remains of the burn marks in 2003, which they've now cleaned the walls. So it's evident that something exploded and it's created this knock-on effect. Now, upon reviewing Dunn's preliminary manuscript at his request, prior to publication in 1998, I must admit his theory presented some problems. Already having decided from the influence and insistence of Hakim that water, Asgat, was the source of the hydrogen and energy of the Great Pyramid, I was greatly impressed with Dunn's logic and observations and had to reconcile these apparent divergent theories. My own personal observations in the Great Pyramid in 1997 and 1998 had led me to agree with Dunn that an accident had indeed occurred in the King's Chamber. The walls of the chamber do obviously bulge out and can be seen to be separating from the floor. I have taken photographs of the ceiling cracks, and no one else but Christopher Dunn has attempted to explain the discoloration of the granite stone box, erroneously referred to as a sarcophagus in the chamber. Cut from Aswan rose granite, the box today is a chocolate brown, not the natural colour of the granite. Dunn proposes this discoloration is from the accident, a great explosion that caused a chemical reaction in the granite, greatly darkening its colour. Now I can weave this tapestry together and present a hypothesis tying in the last chapter and what I have stated so far in this one. I propose synthesizing the works of Victor Schwarberger, Johann Grander, Christopher Dunn, and the indigenous teachings of Hakim, that indeed water was the original medium and source of energy of the Giza power plant. When the Per Netta was originally completed as a functioning power plant, in my opinion, well over 20,000 years ago, Kinnaman had stated he and Petrie found the proof that the pyramid was over 36,000 years old. Water was the source of the power, catalytically converted to oxygen and hydrogen in a beautifully controlled implosion reaction. In our lengthy discussions on the subject, Christopher Dunn had proposed a dilemma for me. If water was the original source for the hydrogen gas used by the Giza power plant, then why were there two shafts in the Queen's Chamber, the reaction chamber, where only one would be necessary if water was the medium used? The answer came to me after long hours of meditation and thought on this subject. Browsing through my many books with scenes of the temple reliefs, my eyes stopped on one scene which provided the answer. A familiar scene on many Per Bar temple walls depicts the king as the realized initiate, being anointed with water by two of the netters, the Dejuhuti, I can't pronounce that, sorry, or Thoth and Horus. I have called this scene the two waters, and I've seen it over and over again since the initial revelation. In the spirit of Schwarberger's elucidation of many different types of water, it has become obvious to me that the Khemitians also recognized different waters and were depicting two specific ones in their scenes. The Dejuhuti, although depicted as a male netta, is a lunar, feminine principle or wisdom. Wisdom is also feminine in the Tibetan tradition. Horus is a solar netta, a masculine principle, perhaps that of compassion, as in the Tibetan tradition. It now became clear to me why Hakim had spent so much time showing us two different tunnel systems, one deep underground and the other closer to the surface. The reason for two shafts to deliver the water into the Queen's Chamber is that two types of water were utilized. A cold water coming from the underground Nile through the tunnels under the Giza Plateau, lunar in nature, feminine, and a heated water coursing closer to the surface through basalt and granite and charged with solar power, masculine in energy, coming through the round and square holes cut into the bedrock for that purpose. This then is the meaning of the Asgat Nefer in practical usage by the ancient Khemitians. Using both feminine and masculine waters combined provided a Nefer state to produce tremendous amounts of hydrogen in a clean implosion reaction. This reaction went on for many thousands of years with a seemingly endless supply of power by virtue of the great fluvials, rainy periods, to produce the water needed for the hydrogen. But something happened. Perhaps great periods of drought occurred due to radically decreased rainfall and the Nile dried up, or was radically decreased, resulting in a depletion of the water source. And that's why we have a desert. Another possibility is that consciousness declined due to the waning of the senses as the age of Aten, the wiser, came to a close, and water was abandoned as the source and chemicals substituted, or a combination of both. Whatever the reason, the use of chemicals led to the staining and salt precipitation Dunn mentions, and instead of the creative implosion reaction of the wondrous Asgat Nefer, a destructive explosion occurred, as stated by Dunn. Therefore, the crypts of Dendera may be telling this exact story of a misuse of a great energy known to the ancient Khemitians and warning of a possible future occurrence. I propose this explosion, the accident in the King's Chamber, may have occurred between 12,000 to 6,000 years ago and is a real event that was incorporated into the myth of Atlantis. A problem that does arise with this explanation, and which has been voiced to me in presentations I have given over the last few years, is how could the ancient Khemitans, being in advanced states of awareness and consciousness, have resorted to the use of chemicals and allowed this accident to occur? Further complications with this idea are that the 12,000, 6,000 year time frame would be in the Khemitian age of Aten, the time of full use of the senses and flowering of consciousness. I do admit that this is still a problem for me today, but the fact remains that the crypts of Dendera present a warning of the misuse of knowledge and technology, and an accident did occur in the Great Pyramid. With the drying up of their water source, the Urnil, the waning of the senses as Aten moved closer to the time of Ammon, and the world cataclysmic event occurring around 9,500 BC, a collective fear would have forced the ancient Khemitans to resort to the use of chemicals and an explosion reaction for their source of energy and power. As Edgar Cayce stated in his readings, Atlantis fell as the result of a misuse of its power and technology and a disregard for natural law. The release of Dendera warned about a past misuse of energy, the fall of Atlantis. I propose the myth of Atlantis was given to the Greeks as a metaphor for real events that happened in the ancient Khemit. And indeed, Khemit and Atlantis were not separate civilizations. So just to end that note, my point here is we are seemingly coming to the end of another era with this proposed Agenda 2030. And yeah, a lot may go down in the next few years. Very interesting stuff. And I'm sorry it was quite long-winded, but I just wanted to get that point across. It seems to me that we live in these cycles and we become technologically advanced and something happens and then we seem to reset. But the most important thing to take out of this is there is a group of people who have access to the ancient wisdom. They keep it, and if we can restart civilization again, imagine the kind of advantage that they would have, slowly leaking out technology as if it's something we've just come up with. Nah. All right. I've nearly lost my voice. I'll see you in part 6. I can't wait to share with you the next chapter. And as we say on this podcast, having it large. Keep tuned. I'll see you soon.